Good morning, John.
Morning, Sean.
Thank you for joining us for this project by World Travel Market London and World Tourism Forum Lucerne. You're a veteran on environment, conservation, sustainable development. I recall meeting 20 years ago in UNEP when we were negotiating environmental governance in Nairobi. You were Secretary General of CITES for nearly a decade, and recently appointed to a senior role by the UK government as chairperson of the Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. It's a big word, I must get that right. You're also a long-time participant in the activities of the World Tourism Forum Lucerne think tank. So understand this relationship between biodiversity and tourism very well. Maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about your role in the UK government initiative, and then offer us some reflections on this complex relationship, and especially illegal wildlife trade.
Great, thanks Sean. Thanks for that generous introduction, and thanks for your own personal commitment to the whole issue of illegal wildlife trade, but protecting wildlife more generally. And you've been a champion of the cause for many decades yourself. With the UK, they've appointed me as chair of the Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. This is a fund that was created by the UK following the 2014 London Conference on Illegal Wildlife Trade. And really it was a fund established to enable the government to support initiatives to implement the outcomes of that conference. And then there were subsequent conferences in Kasane, in Hanoi, and another London conference in 2018. So this fund there is really to help implement the outcomes. It's all about efforts to stop illegal wildlife trade, but it looks at it from many different angles, you know, livelihoods perspective, from enforcement, demand reduction, etc. So a very holistic approach to how we are going to stop the illegal wildlife trade.
Now, if you look at travel and tourism and the biodiversity balance sheet of our industry, there's many positives, but there's unfortunately also some negatives. And one of those are illegal trade in wildlife species. What's been the progress? How's industry been responding? And what more can we do from a tourism industry side?
Yeah, so this is a global problem. The UN Office of Drugs and Crime has now put out a couple of reports back in 2014 and another one just recently. There are around 6,000 or more species found in illegal trade across around 150 countries. This is a trade that's worth anything between 20 billion and 200 billion, whether or not you look at just CITES listed, which are species that are internationally protected, or species more generally, including those that are not protected, depriving countries of revenue, anything up to 12 billion a year. And it has a huge effect on ecosystem services, including climate mitigation. So this is a big issue. It's a global issue. It affects a lot of species, worth a lot of money, has a lot of impacts. And the tourism sector both has an impact on illegal wildlife trade, positive and negative. What I've been very pleased about is how the tourism industry has been stepping up to see how they can help fight illegal wildlife trade. Not only just because it's worth doing, but also it's in the industry's own self-interest, because wildlife-based tourism relies upon those wildlife assets. And if they're being stolen and depleted and they disappear over time, the asset's gone and the opportunity for tourism is gone as well. So we've seen the World Tourism Forum Lucerne have this on its agenda. We've seen the World Travel and Tourism Council address the issue. We've seen Prince William, through his United for Wildlife task force, address the whole transport sector. So we're seeing multiple entities address this issue. We had a declaration come out of the World Travel and Tourism Council, now over 100 companies there. The Buckingham Palace Declaration on Illegal Wildlife Trade in the transport sector now has 120 companies that signed up. So we're seeing a lot of interest, a lot of activity. Hasn't got everyone on board yet, but I think there's a deep recognition of the interface between tourism and illegal wildlife trade and protecting wildlife more generally, and the importance of doing more.
So look, the purpose of this series is not to name and shame. It's to really celebrate the success stories, celebrate best practice, because those are the things that we want to scale, that we want to replicate. So I want to ask you about airlines and airports, which is a critical part of this value chain. Is there maybe one or two examples that you can share with us of airlines and airports really excelling, and that's worth following on this?
Yeah, we've seen International Air Transport Association, the Air Transport Action Group, industry associations get right behind this. We've seen some airports and some airlines get involved. Perhaps the airlines that have stood out for me are airlines like Emirates, Qatar, these airlines, also Etihad, a number of airlines that have stepped up and have been very active in engaging with their staff, with their clients, the way in which they publicize themselves, the way in which they provide an entry point for sharing intelligence. So anything their staff see or hear on the ground, they can share with enforcement authorities. So I think, in that region, with these airlines, Emirates, Etihad, Qatar, we've seen some very good progress made. That's not to say others haven't as well, but they're three that have stood out for me.
With your past involvement, the current involvement in African parks, and it's also very close to my heart, poaching, rhinos, elephants in Southern Africa, a very big issue. Where have we made progress in the last 10 years? What progress is just didn't you see coming and impresses you today if you look at where we started 2 decades ago, and which species have we made most progress on?
Yeah, if I just go back to 2010, in 2010, we were experiencing a surge in illegal trade. There was very little political or public recognition of the scale of it and the consequences of it. And in many cases, these were treated as very minor offences, something equivalent to a traffic offence. So we were really way behind the 8 ball in terms of turning around these trends. I think since then, we've seen a lot of political buy-in and acceptance that these are really serious crimes that have serious consequences. We've seen greater public recognition. We've seen the private sector really get involved, and we've talked about airports, airlines, but the transport sector, the travel and tourism sector get involved, as well as others, zoos and aquariums like the American Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and many other sectors have started to recognize this is a real problem. So if we fast forward to today, what we've got is much better buy-in politically through the public, through the private sector. We've seen a shift in thinking to start treating these crimes as serious crimes. We've seen a recognition that we need to protect wildlife at source, but also deal with the demand side. So how do we suppress demand? So we've seen a lot of activity there. We've seen the multilateral system come together. UN Office of Drugs and Crime is now taking this more seriously. Interpol, World Customs Organization. So we've seen a bit of a shift away from this being a minor thing that's off radar to being seen as a serious issue that is on radar and starting to be dealt with much more seriously. We've had some very good progress with some species, in particular the African elephant. They were really suffering 10 years ago or so. 100,000 elephants killed for their ivory over just a 3-year period. We've seen fantastic success there, in particular in Southern and Eastern Africa, where the poaching and the smuggling has really dropped significantly. Still some work to go in Central and Western Africa, but in Southern and Eastern Africa, really good progress there through collective effort from source through to destination. A lot of good work going on in China, Thailand, elsewhere, as well as in the source states.
Well,
other species, I couldn't say the same though. We've gone backwards with pangolin, unfortunately. Better protection under international law, but since that better protection came into place, we haven't seen any shift. We've seen actually a surge in illegal trade in the meat and the scales of this wonderful animal, the pangolin.
How did COVID-19 impact the supply chains and the channel between demand and supply?
Yeah, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on the whole planet in many different ways. And as you well know, the conservation business model, in particular in Africa, has relied very heavily upon wildlife-based tourism, which has underpinned a lot of the conservation effort and generated a lot of jobs and a lot of revenue. Now, that just fell off a cliff edge. All of a sudden, from having fantastic revenue and great projections going forward to nothing. So that has left a lot of enforcement agencies with less resources, local communities with less employment, less access. So it's a real problem. And the next 2-3 years, as we come out of this, we're going to have to look at other ways of dealing with it. What does it mean for poaching and smuggling? Well, on one hand, it can disrupt supply chains. it can perhaps mean there's less money for people to spend on illegally sourced wildlife products. But on the other hand, as we see jobs drop, revenue drop, we could see an uptake in poaching, both for subsistence poaching, but also for illegal trade across international borders. So we don't quite know yet whether we're going to see a surge or not. What we do know is we have to find other ways of generating employment and generating revenue as we work our way out of this pandemic and the economic consequences, because the threat to wildlife is massive, because it's not generating the revenue it was pre-pandemic, and the land use becomes less competitive. It just becomes very challenging for conservation.
So we cannot discuss this issue without also touching on legal trophy hunting and sustainable offtake. Always a polarizing issue. Is there a middle ground on this? How do we make sure that our conservation also creates livelihoods, that it's about communities and people in nature?
Yeah, the critical thing is that local people living within and amongst wildlife must benefit from that wildlife. And that's something that the tourism sector and the travel sector has been very conscious of, and something that we've been pushing very hard. If there's wildlife-based tourism, it needs to benefit local people, not just the investor. So here with hunting, trophy hunting, I don't think there's any middle ground there. I think it's very polarized. There are those who support and those who are against. Perhaps the only middle ground would be if trophy hunting were to be stopped, if that was the trend, that it doesn't happen overnight, because that is unfair to local people who are deriving their livelihood through legal trophy hunting. You would have to look at a way of phasing it out over time and providing alternatives. That would be the only middle ground I would see, because the two camps are so polarized for and against. But I think we always have to distinguish between trophy hunting and subsistence hunting. So you can also have legal subsistence hunting where local people hunt for protein. And I think we need to distinguish this very much so. Trophy hunting, where someone comes in from somewhere else, hunts and takes the trophy back to where they came from, that generates a lot, as you know, of very excited debate, and people, have very strongly held views. But the subsistence hunting by local people with a sustainable offtake for protein is quite different, and we need to distinguish the two. Yeah, but the only middle ground I would see is a phasing out. That would be the only middle ground that I could see. Otherwise, I think the two camps are very much entrenched in their positions.
So John, I'm going to conclude by asking you if you had a 20-second elevator pitch to multilateral organizations, governments, and the private sector, respectively, what would that be?
At a multilateral level, we need to change the legal architecture. We need to have a dedicated global agreement on wildlife crime, which we don't have yet. We've been relying on a trade convention. We need a dedicated agreement on wildlife crime. We can do that under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. That's what we need at the multilateral level, as well as have wildlife trade laws take public health issues into effect. At the national level, treat wildlife crime as a serious crime and identify, protect, and invest much more in biodiverse rich places, because there are multiple benefits there: climate benefits, biodiversity benefits, health benefits, employment benefits. At the industry level, don't lose hope, continue to invest in conservation. And when you invest in conservation, with all the benefits it has, including the wildlife tourism sector, don't forget that we have to generate local benefits, decent local jobs for local people if it's going to sustain itself over the longer term.
Thank you, John. Much appreciate you making time this morning.
Thanks, Sean. Pleasure.